Here is where I lay it down, every burden, every crown. This is my surrender. This is my surrender. Here is where I lay it down, every lie and every doubt. This is my surrender.
Whatever you want to, whatever you want to, and I will make room for you to do whatever you want to, whatever you want to, Lord.
Here is where I lay it down, every burden, every crown. This is my surrender. This is my surrender. Here is where I lay it down, every lie and every doubt. This is my surrender.
And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to. And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to, whatever you want to, shake up the ground of all my tradition, break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better. Ooh. Shake up the ground of all my tradition, break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better. Your way is better. Shake up the ground of all my tradition, break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better. Your way is better. And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to, whatever you want to. And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to, Lord.
Here is where I lay it down. You are all I'm chasing now. This is my surrender. This is my surrender. Here is where I lay it down. You are all I'm chasing now. This is my surrender. This is my surrender.
The Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. face shine upon you, and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace.
Hi there. I want to invite you to a new thing that we're starting at Westside to help us all grow together in our journey of following Jesus. This is something we're going to call short circles. Short circles are going to be short-term online small groups that are focused on particular subjects that are going to be of interest to all of us. While we're restricted from meeting together, we felt it would be important for us to have the opportunity to continue our discipleship journeys. So short circles are going to run at various points throughout the week, offering you a chance to engage for 3 or 4 weeks at a time in areas that you might want to grow in. Be that your study of the Bible, your growth as a parent, navigating issues of technology, diving deeper into your devotional life, or encouraging yourself to think about ways you can missionally grow in your concern for justice and oppressed peoples. We want to invite you to engage with at least one of these short circles so that your discipleship journey isn't stunted or halted while we can't meet together. So what I'd love for you to do is this. Go to the website at wkc.org/circles and browse through the options of short circles that perhaps are enticing to you. Sign up, register, and then we'll see you online throughout next month as these things come to life as opportunities for us all.
Westside, our February menu is ready to launch, and here's a few things to highlight. The Big Read is still happening. Pick up Rich Viota's deeply formed life book as we journey together with it. Also, we're introducing The Big Watch. Make a plan with family or friends and watch an episode weekly through this film series found on Right Now Media. Right Now Media is free for everyone and available on our webpage. Lent and the journey towards Easter begins on Ash Wednesday, February 17th. This year, we invite you to join us for Liturgy at Home. Register at wkc.org/menu, and we will deliver a service kit to your home that contains all that you need to lead your house in this annual service from the Christian calendar. We'll provide music to listen to, prayers, readings, and devotions to participate in so that you can start a new tradition in your own space. And lastly, the Sanctuary course begins Monday, February 8th, and is continuing to discover the common language of mental health, stigma, self-care, and more. To register for the Sanctuary and for all other program information, go to wkc.org/menu.
In this series, we're considering how to form our lives more deeply. A key observation for us is that the trajectory of our society is increasingly towards having more superficial lives, to sort of living life on the surface rather than deeply. What this means, however, because of the trajectory of the way things are going right now, is that if we track backwards through history, we discover that thinking more deeply about our interior lives actually isn't some sort of new fad, but rather the pattern that the ancients took very, very seriously. An example of this is in the Hebrew book of songs and worship known as the Psalms. We talked about the Psalms in the summer series at WKC for the past few summers. But it's wrong if all we think is that this is a songbook. Because the Psalms are packed with searching, reflective, interior examination. In fact, the psalmists would often make good psychologists' patients. They think about grief and pain, anger, their fears, they rage, but they also work out their love and their joy and awe and wonder. The Psalms are a display of raw humanity. Whereas I think our contemporary approach is often not to examine what's going on under the surface, The psalmists, they, however, confess that this type of examination before God is a way to a more holistic humanity. So if you turn your Bible or your Bible app over to Psalm 139, and you'll kind of see what we mean as we read some of its moments that exemplify what it is that we're talking about today. Psalm 139, beginning at verse 1, it says this: "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely." Like, just think about what David, the author of this psalm, is saying here. He's identifying that there's much, much more to him than what is seen by anybody else. There's hiddenness and unseen stuff. But God, well, God knows all of that stuff. Which, of course, if God knows about it, it means it's there. Like, you know that word that you didn't expect to say? Like, it was in you. Like, it didn't come from nowhere. It's just kind of like, ouch, that's not what I always want to hear. But David continues in the psalm in verse 7 to explore how it is that God knows him. He says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will cover me, and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you." Like, beneath the surface of these verses where we have this image of God sort of chasing the psalmist around everywhere, there's a realization that if God can know all of this about us, then that sort of stuff is knowable. Like, maybe our lives, our behaviors, our feelings, our anxieties, if they're examined, maybe they don't need to be mysterious and unpredictable. Like, if God can find us, whether our trajectory is towards him or whether it's languishing in the hells of life. But then David makes a fascinating confession at the end of this psalm that lets us see something profoundly aware in him that I kind of want to remember in my own life. In verse 23, he concludes the psalm like this. He says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Like, do you see what David's admitting to here? Like, he's essentially saying that while God might know everything about David, David's not sure that David knows everything about David. Can I get an amen? Can we relate to that sort of feeling? There was an article in December 2020 in The Guardian where the writer Oliver Berkman wrote this. He said, "Humanity is divided into two. On one hand, those who are improvising their way through life, patching solutions together and putting out fires as they go, but deluding themselves otherwise. And on the other hand, those doing exactly the same, except that they know it." Berkman continues, "And it's infinitely better to be in the latter." Like, is Berkman right? Do we tend to divide life up into successful and unsuccessful? Or we divide our lives up into, those of us who have, kind of got it together and the train wrecks? When perhaps we should be thinking in terms of those of us who are aware and those of us who are unaware. Berkman wrote this in December 2020, but compare it now to this thought from Michel de Montaigne, who said, "Everyone rushes elsewhere into the future because no one has arrived at themselves." So Montaigne's writing in the 16th century, Berkman in the 21st. But are they really saying anything different from David the psalmist? And are we listening to them? Like, contemporary life so often seems to be so shallow and one-dimensional. We tend to put all of our efforts into thinking about our lived lives in one dimension, the exterior representation, what everyone else can see. Like, have we become obsessed with our public persona, our public face? Have we in turn ended up with disrupted private interior lives? You know, as you might imagine, like if we only think about our life in one dimension, and in this case the exterior, not the interior dimension, eventually these two aspects, the exterior and the interior, will become out of sync with each other. Like, German has this word, Zerschenheit, which roughly kind of means falling to piecesness. And now think about that phrase for a second, and then think about what David Brooks, the writer, identifies as this. This is the result of multitasking lives, which exist as we're being pulled in hundreds of different directions all the time. And when our lives are doing that, is the best sort of description of what that feels like falling to piecesness, Zerschenheit. We become fragmented, the opposite of integrated. And like, I'm sure we can all relate to that feeling when the way that we're behaving in one context is actually related to something else. Like, what people are seeing of us is the impact of all the other things that are going on in our life. Like, we've all had that one time that one person sort of loses it with us, and the whole time this sort of explosion's happening in front of you, you're kind of aware that something else is going on here. Now, I'm not trying to live in a kind of blame culture, but what I want to say, that the way that we live today, I don't think helps this. We're spread thin, we're stretched, as Brooke says, in hundreds of different ways. You know, and as our society has progressed, we've sort of entered publicly into what Kierkegaard would call the dizziness of freedom. So our external constraints are drastically reduced in our present culture, so that realistically, most of us can publicly do kind of whatever we want. But when you live in a context where you can kind of get away with doing whatever you want publicly, this increases the requirement for a strong internal structure, or a coherence that so often we're all lacking. So I want to invite you today to think about a way of life that involves interior examination. The sort of stop stressing so much about that 10% of the iceberg that we can see, but rather considers what's happening beneath the surface of our lives, so that our lives can flourish and also impact well on all of those who are around us. And this is difficult work for us because we've become increasingly conditioned to unconsciously avoid looking beneath the surface. If you can't see it, don't worry about it. But you know this is a bad way to live, right? I mean, whether it's your car or your washing machine, we all know that ignoring what's going on inside will eventually lead to some sort of breakdown or explosion. And it kind of never happens when you need it to happen. It happens when you least need it or expect it. So why should our lives be any different to our cars and our washing machines? Well, in recent years, you only need to flick through the news or any sort of kind of blog site or form of media, and we see constant collapses amongst people, collapses into toxic behavior, collapses into immoral behavior, collapses into illegal behavior. And we see this in pastors, we see it in business leaders, we see it in politicians. And we actually ourselves, we see it in ourselves for so often choosing to ignore this, both in ourselves and in the leaders of our world. And to me, this tells us This kind of drops it on our doorstep that we need to think more deeply about what's going on inside. As the philosopher Plato recalls Socrates saying, the unexamined life is not worth living. And the Bible invites this. Rich Viodas reminds us that in many places in Scripture, we are invited towards examination. We're invited to look more closely. We're invited to examine ourselves at the communion table. In 1 Corinthians 11, we examine what's going on in us and in our relationships as we come to the table. In 2 Corinthians 13, we're invited to examine our faith. Like, is what we're living out, is our faith consistent with the God we say we believe in? There's an invitation in Lamentations chapter 3 to look at our ways of being and living. Because Lamentations recognizes that there's a tendency in all of us to drift away from God. And then in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 3, 4, and 5, there's an invitation to examine our work and our behavior so that we don't become conceited and falsely proud. So the goal of this approach to examination and this invitation to examine yourself is essentially a two-sided one. On one side, there's an invitation to examine yourself for your own personal flourishing. Like, how do we examine our life so that we can grow away from the sort of destructive interior thoughts that cause us so much damage and lead us into bad patterns and behaviors? But then on the other side, there's also an invitation to examine yourself so that your relational health with God and others can flourish. Like, and maybe you might be hoping for something a little more exciting and compelling than relational health as an invitation to examine yourself. But I think this idea of relational health is something way more significant than we often realize. When Jesus is asked, at one point, he's asked, like, what is the most important thing in life? What's most important in life? The question about the greatest commandment in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 34. Notice that Jesus essentially answers by discussing three relationships. 1, 2, 3. What is the greatest commandment, Jesus? Well, he first talks about loving God. He says, love the Lord your God with your heart, your soul, and your mind. Notice he thinks about what's going on in our interior. But Jesus continues, he says, also love your neighbor as yourself. So love God, love your neighbor, but the reference for how you love your neighbor is how you love yourself. Like 50% of that part of the greatest commandment is to love yourself. How you love your neighbor is defined by how you love yourself. So like, track this with me just for a moment. Elsewhere in Scripture, 1 John 4 is a good example, we learn that the way that we love God is by loving our neighbor. The two are connected. So John says you can't love God and not love your neighbor. That just doesn't work. If you hate your neighbor, then you don't love God. So these two things, love of God and love of neighbor, are connected and worked out together. How would you love God? Love your neighbor. But then Jesus instructs us that the parameter for how we love our neighbor is how we love ourselves. So the connection of God to neighbor, the connection of me to God, the connection of me to my neighbor. The relational connections are fundamentally important here. And now, just as an aside, the dysfunction that happens when these relationships break down, the Bible's word for that is sin. When we find ourselves in relational disconnection and dysfunction. So hold that sort of image in your mind just for a minute about this three-way relationship. And let me just say this. Our own interior examination is going to define how we perceive and relate to ourselves. It's going to help me with that. But if I can really think about how I relate to myself, that in turn will affect how I relate to others. But how I relate to others defines how I love God. So is interior examination important? Well, maybe, you might say. especially if I want to live out what Jesus says is the greatest commandment: to love God, to love neighbor, and to love myself. So, taking Psalm 139 as a model of interior examination, let's notice three things that David does, and in doing them, avoids other things that are disastrous to our own attempts to be alert to what's going on beneath the surface of the iceberg. Notice this. David took the time to reflect. I mean, he actually thinks about what's going on in his life and writes it down in a psalm. He adopts a posture of humility towards his own ignorance. He knows the stuff that he doesn't know that's going on, but he reaches out to God to talk about that. And he's also alert to his own fragmentation or lack of integration. Another way to say it is you could say it like this: David avoids the pitfalls of busyness, of arrogance, and of compartmentalization. So let's talk about those. Let's talk about busyness for a moment. There's no real way around it, but to think reflectively about our interior lives is going to take time. David, he takes the time to write a psalm, and you don't get the impression he's just kind of typing this out on his phone on the train. He stopped and took time to do this. An interior examination begins with the commitment to give it some time. Busyness works against interior examination because we limit the amount of space that we have for, solitary reflection, prayer, devotion, listening to what's going on in us and listening to God. And then what happens is, our reactions to what happens around us become drawn from our instinct rather than the depths of our being. So busyness, we think about arrogance for a moment. I'm always struck that David is writing many of the Psalms while he's the king. The idea of this level of humility from a modern political leader is almost humorous. But David's talking openly about what's going on inside him. Because a pathway to interior examination isn't rooted in insecurity, but rather the security of accepting that you don't know it all. David says to God, you know me better than I know myself. The world draws us into arrogance, into convincing ourselves that we don't need to examine or think about ourselves or have mentors, or even sometimes we don't even think we need to listen to others. But as Donald Rumsfeld famously said in 2002, it's the things you don't know that tend to be difficult. And finally, think about compartmentalizing for a second. Look carefully at what David also does in this psalm. He kind of opens everything up for examination. In verse 14 to 16, he admits that nothing is hidden from God. And we have this intense tendency to try and compartmentalize parts of our lives, to kind of keep them away from God and our own examination. We want to box it up and just don't go there. And this is disastrous, as generally those unpleasant and broken parts, those are the parts that fester in the background and slowly leak out in our dysfunctions. So think about the Hebrew notion of shalom, often understood as peace. It's a word that reflects the peace that comes from wholeness. If we divide up our lives and refuse to examine the uncomfortable and possibly even scary parts, might we then be avoiding the wholeness and peace that we want in life? But if we can avoid the busyness, reject the arrogance, and resist the compartmentalizing, what we might discover is that opening up all of our parts, both hidden and uncomfortable, to God will only expose us to His love and acceptance and a pathway to a deeper life. Jump back into Psalm 139 for a second at verse 13. David says, "It was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. Interior examination in the presence of God is to expose ourselves to what God already knows. But as I've done throughout this series so far, I'm going to continue to encourage you to read this book by Rich Viodas, The Deeply Formed Life, and dig into the practical steps that he offers to navigate basically these different aspects of gaining depth on our journey. Rich, today on this subject, offers 4 areas that are worth us spending just a little bit of time on and working on in our own lives. These areas might speak to why we act and react the ways that we do in our lives. Approaches that we can kind of hold under the title, Search Me and Know Me, as David says to God. The first area that Rich invites us to think about as a practice is our family of origin. He notes that we have patterns, traumas, and scripts to our lives that are the result of trajectories that we have been set on by our primary caregivers. Now, the majority of the time, our parents are trying their absolute best to be the best for us. But we can still, despite that, adopt ways of being from them that can be negative. And when we end up entrenched in particular ways of thinking or being, it can often require patient interior examination. Like one tool that helps us examine that whole aspect of our lives and move towards greater healing in this is something called the genogram, which is a key part of the emotional healthy spirituality program that we run at WKC regularly. It helps you to examine the sort of habits and behaviors you've picked up through your upbringing and life. Very soon we're going to be hosting a short circle here at Westside online that will focus on this, and I'd really encourage you to sign up for that and give some examination to that part of your life. The second thing that we can do as a practice is examine our anxiety. All of us have anxieties. I know that as much as the next person. And some of our anxieties are acute, as in we just get anxious about one particular thing at that particular moment. But some of our anxieties are chronic. They're kind of always there. But anxiety can be very, very bad at keeping us stuck in certain places and behaviors and ways of being that are unnecessary when we examine them. Like I've often found it helpful to try and actually examine what's going on in my fear and anxiety to decide whether the effect that I'm going through is justifiable. Like sometimes simply analyzing what is actually going on that's bringing about my anxiety versus what I feel is happening can help me get back on the feet again. I can blow it out of proportion in my anxiety this way, but a little bit of time to reflect and examine what's actually happening can really help me ultimately to avoid behaving in unsynchronized ways, where what's actually going on and what I'm doing get out of sync. So there's your first 2 practices to think about. Where have I come from? And what's going on with my anxiety? The second 2 practices, I'm going to need you to write a couple of things down. If you don't have the book yet, you're just going to want to note them down. Number 3 is spend some time examining your feelings. There's a subtle difference between emotions and feelings. Emotions are almost always unconscious. They just kind of happen. It's our reaction to what's going on around about us or to us. But our feelings are the sort of conscious perceptions that we have of those emotions. And often we've learned and been taught or picked up somewhere along the line that we should probably repress our feelings to kind of keep them out of the way. But your feelings, when properly listened to, can guide you through what's going on in you. Importantly, the question we often want to ask is, what are my feelings doing to me right now? Are they guiding me into a deeper life, or are they pushing me back towards the shallow end? And if we're brave enough to examine how we feel, we provide an outlet for the kind of damaging effect of just letting our feelings fester. So here's 4 questions. And Rich calls these questions explore the iceberg. 4 questions you want to ask about your feelings when you feel them kind of building up on you. Question number 1, what is it that you're mad about? Question number 2, what is it that you're sad about? Question 3, what are you anxious about? And question 4, what are you glad about? And what you might find, and I would encourage you to do this, is work through these questions when you're wrestling with your feelings. Work through them perhaps alone or with your partner or someone that's safe for you. And see what comes to light in your own life that might give you some direction and trajectory of where you need some healing. And finally, our 4th practice is to examine your reactions. Like we need to learn, I need to learn so often that how I react to something says a lot about me. And I'm not always proud of my reactions. In fact, too often, my reactions are actually overreactions. But they always tell the truth. They always tell the truth about what's going on within me. And perhaps it's that I've seen a certain person that reacts, that causes me to react, or I hear a particular idea that brings something up in me. I mean, most of us have this, right? Yet often we fail to ask, why am I reacting this way? Why is this triggering me like it is? Like if we can examine our reactions, then we open up the possibility of more freedom in our own lives. Like, wouldn't it be great to get an email from that person and not have your mind go down that negative path? Vioda says that in the examination of our reactions, we can live from a place of depth, wisdom, and discernment. Like we can see more clearly. We can reject the lies that we tell ourselves and stop making just those false assumptions about other people. So again, he offers us 5 questions to ask when you're feeling yourself reacting negatively. And here they are. Question 1, what happened to produce this reaction? Question 2, what are you feeling? Question 3, what's the story that I'm telling myself right now about what I think is happening? Key question number 4, what does the gospel say? What does it say about you? What does it say about the person that's causing this reaction in you? What does it say about the situation? And then question 5 is, what counter-instinctual action is needed? Like, what do you need to do at this particular moment to change the way that you think? In Psalm 139, David confesses that we are pretty impressively made. But that means that there's complexity to us. And that complexity means that there's work to be done to find depth and wholeness. I want to encourage you to spend time regularly in self-examination. This is going to allow God's grace to be present to us, for us to be more free to escape our own dysfunctions, and to become, deep followers of Jesus. And therefore, as deep followers of Jesus, we can be a healthy and whole presence in the world who can live out that great commandment to love well. So may God help you to journey the path of Psalm 139. May you find wholeness in knowing that God knows you completely and invites you to examine your own being and self. And may you refocus the energy that we so often use to examine others into the path of examining yourself. And may you flourish so that you might love God and your neighbor well. And may His grace and peace be with you.
Behold the Father's heart, the mystery He lavishes on us, as deep cries out to deep. Oh, how desperately He wants us. The things of earth stand next to Him like a candle to the sun. Unfailing Father, what compares witness to his great love. Behold his holy Son, the Lion and the Lamb given to us. The Word became a man, that my soul shall know its Savior. Forsaken for the sake of all mankind, salvation is in his blood. Jesus Messiah, the righteous died for love. Then sings my soul, then sings my soul, how great your love is, how great your love is. Then sings my soul, then sings my soul.